We are recording now, and we're going to go right to our slides. The last thing we discussed was American feelings about World War I. Politically, we were staying neutral, as this was President Wilson's wishes. Economically, businesses and bankers were benefiting from the needs of Central Powers. Businesses would provide supplies, and bankers were providing loans to those countries. During this time of the war, the British Navy put a blockade, as you can see here on the slide. Let me make that a little bigger. Remember how close in proximity Britain was to Germany. So Britain, having the greatest navy at the time, used the navy to blockade the German coast so they would not be receiving these supplies, which included supplies from us. While we primarily did our trading with the Central Powers, we also still continued to trade with Germany. This blockade caused a famine in Germany because they were not getting food or fertilizers, and it hurt some of the American businesses financially, causing Americans to become angry with Britain because they were threatening our freedom to cross the seas and do trade. The Germans responded with submarine or U-boat warfare, and they began to not only bomb and sink English vessels, but also other vessels, merchant vessels, including American vessels. And it was through this warfare on the sea that we got involved militarily. May 7th, 1915, a British liner named the Lusitania was sunk, and basically 1,200 people perished, and 1/10 of them, 128, were Americans. The Germans made an agreement, basically a verbal one, that they would, after this sinking and killing of Americans and the outcry from the American public, Wilson and the government worked to get the Germans to basically agree that they would no longer engage in submarine warfare with civilian ships, but they did resume that, and this is what brought us into war. President Wilson was willing to show patience because the Germans said they would resume warfare and they would sink all ships in the British waters, whether they were hostile or not. And so instead of just launching into war, Wilson said he would wait for an outright attack before he declared war. During this time, the British intelligence agents intercepted a telegram. This telegram was from a German foreign minister whose last name was Zimmermann. He was a German ambassador in Mexico. And he received from the German foreign minister a telegram which basically encouraged Mexico to get into a war with the United States. And Germany promised that if Mexico would go to war with the U.S., Germany would eventually help Mexico recover some of their lost territory that the United States had acquired, especially in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. This is known as the Zimmermann telegram. And this, along with the German warfare, led Congress to declare war on Germany April 6, 1917. So America mobilizes for war. We're really not prepared to go to war. We only have 200,000 enlisted men when the war was declared. So the government created what's called the WIB, the War Industries Board, created in 1917. And this board went about doing several things, as you can see here. They instituted the draft or selective service in 1917. This required men to register with the government in case they ever had a random draft in which they would select people into the military service. However, by 1918, 24 million had registered, by 1918, and out of that, 3 million were called up. So quite an increase from only 200,000 enlisted men to 3 million who were called out of the draft. Then 2 million were sent over to the theater of battle in Europe. Congress gave power to President Wilson to basically act unilaterally, and as the head of our government during this war, it basically gave him power to take over some of the private industries, such as the railroads, certain industries that would be needed and used to help produce weapons, war-related industries, and then they also took over farms for food production. And part of Wilson's task was to put together this War Industries Board, the WIB. The Food Administration also had a part in the war. Of course, farmers needing to produce food that could be sent over to help the Central Powers, as well as producing food for our country and for our troops. The Food Administration also encouraged our civilians who were still back here in America to conserve food. They didn't ration food. Instead, they emphasized certain days like Meatless Monday, or I'm sorry, Meatless Tuesdays. Mondays were Wheatless Mondays. Thursdays and Saturdays were to be porkless days. So they had days in which they abstained from certain types of foods. The government produced what were called bonds that people could buy, and so much would go to the war effort. They became known as Liberty Bonds. Also during this time, with so many men going off to war, there was a new labor force that came into existence as women left the domestic atmosphere or the domestic realm and entered into jobs at factories and farms, industries, and railroads, filling in for the positions that were left open by the men who went to war. Other minorities were a part of the war effort. Many Southern blacks migrated from the South to the Northeast and the North, as so many men in the Northeast and in the North went into the war and left these positions open to work. Our textbook mentions the Great Migration of about 400,000 African Americans leaving the South and going north, northeast, working in those places that had become open. During this time also, 100,000 people from Mexico came across the border looking for jobs in the United States. A new labor force came about during World War I and our involvement in it. Also, there was a loss of civil liberties in America during the last part of World War I. The government passed the Espionage Acts and then the Sedition Acts in 1917 and 1918. Basically, what these things did was they made it against the law for a citizen to criticize our government leaders and anything to do with the war. So that is a direct violation of what amendment? If you couldn't criticize the government with your speech, what amendment is the government violating? The First Amendment. The First Amendment to the Constitution, in which we have the right to free speech. But during the war effort, these two acts were passed to keep people from criticizing the government and their policies. Talked about the Great Migration, 400,000 African Americans moving from the south to the north and northeast. Women taking over many of the jobs that the men had vacated. And one thing to remember is the women getting involved in the war effort, and many of them being out in the public square in the workplace. This helped to bolster support for the 19th Amendment to be passed 100 years ago in giving women the right to vote. What we're going to do is we're going to close with just mentioning a couple of things to end the chapter 21. In 1917, Russia pulled out of the war. And the reason this happened is you had a revolution take place in Russia. Up to this point, Russia had a king, or what they would call a czar, who ruled the nation like a royal, a royal family. And during the war, the czar had allowed a provisional government to lead the nation. Well, during this time, a group of communists who went by the name Bolsheviks, they revolted, and in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution brought in Vladimir Lenin as the new dictator of Russia, and he had put to death all the family of the czars, of the czar. He pulled Russia out of the war, World War I, and Russia entered into a civil war between these rebels, these revolutionaries, and those who still followed the czar. With Russia out of the war, Germany no longer had to worry about them, and so they focused on the Western Front, which you'll recall is that area, that border between Belgium and France and Germany. The Americans, after having entered the war in 1917, were able to come in and help the French with the Germans as they were invading. And eventually, World War I came to an end as Austria-Hungary surrendered. Germany had groups within Germany revolt against the government. And so Germany could not stay strong to fight all of the Allied powers. And so on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour in 1918, Germany signed a truce or an armistice that ended World War I. But the American presence helped tremendously to bring this war to an end after we entered in 1917. Up until that time, World War I was the bloodiest war, with a death toll of about 22 million people, and more than half of those being civilians. Another 20 million people were wounded. 10 million people became refugees. And for that time, the cost of the war was $338 million, which would be much inflated in today's dollars. The United States lost 48,000 people to the combat, another 62,000 to disease, and over 200,000 were wounded. After the war was over, and if you have your textbook, please join me. On page 788, remember about Wilson that he tried to approach foreign policy with the doctrine called moral diplomacy. He felt like he was wise enough and chosen by God to be the arbiter of peace. And after the end of the war, he brought forth a plan called the 14 points, and you'll want to know that for the test. And this was a list of what he envisioned happening to bring peace and truly classify World War I as the war to end all wars. One of the things that the 14 points called for was for a creation of a League of Nations. This is on page 793. You can see at the bottom of page 793 that the League of Nations was formed, but ironically, our Congress voted that we would not join the League of Nations.
No.
So we're going to stop there, and I'm going to go over with you what will be on the test. If you have not finished chapter 21, you'll need to read that last section. We did not go over it. Make sure you read chapter 22. And I did provide earlier today a short video that would summarize chapter 22. And I think I'm going to give you an extra day for the test, which would be Sunday, the 8th. But actually, it'll be an extra half day because I will not make the test available until tomorrow morning. But I'll give you the extra day of Sunday to finish it up. If you have your textbooks, let's go to chapter 20. If you're still in chapter 21, page 793 is what I last mentioned, where the League of Nations is mentioned. And so be familiar with, for the test, Wilson's 14 points, his 14-point plan. and you don't have to know all 14 points, but just know what it is, and know what the League of Nations is. On page 795, you need to know what the Treaty of Versailles is. This was the treaty that ended World War I and forced Germany to disarm its military and basically dismantle it. And then they had to pay war reparations, as well as give up their colonies around the world. So know about the Treaty of Versailles. Concerning the last section on lurching from war to peace, which begins on page 799. If you'll go to page 802, I want you to be familiar with the first Red Scare. We had the first Red Scare, and then we had a second Red Scare in which our government and our country became afraid and paranoid about communism coming into our country. And then we had the Cold War and the nuclear race and threats with Russia in the 80s. Russia, the USSR disbanded. But now again, as you guys probably know, if you watch any of the debates or the news, we are once again, it hasn't been called a Red Scare, but there's a lot of anxiety and fear within our government that Russia has tampered with the 2016 election, and they're trying to tamper again in the 2020. So be familiar with the first Red Scare, which happened 100 years ago, page 802 and 803. And then we're going to go to chapter 22. And if you look on page 809, actually, if you start on page 808 at the bottom, we're going to talk about the era of consumption. The 1920s are called the Roaring Twenties, and if you'll watch that video, it's only 13 minutes, guys, so make sure you watch that. But you'll get information about the Roaring Twenties, 1920s, and it was a time where consumerism and consumption was more prevalent in our society, and we had kind of a consumer culture emerge. And I want you to know some of the various strands of the consumer culture beginning on page 810, like movies and television and radio. Actually, it would be just movies, not television. The radio craze. Aviation, the rise of aviation, the rise of automobiles. This is going through page 815. The rise of sports. The rise of jazz culture. Know about these different strands of the consumer culture that rose up in the 1920s. make sure you know what modernism is. Modernism, page 822. And then there's a section that our textbook calls the reactionary 20s. So not only is it a time of roaring 20s where culture and the things of mass culture and consumption are rising, but you also have a reactionary tendency in the 20s. Americans reacted to immigrants again coming in. Americans reacted with a rise of a new Ku Klux Klan. There was a religious reaction called fundamentalism. And please be familiar with the Scopes trial mentioned on page 830. The Scopes trial, there was a reaction to alcohol consumption, and there was a movement called prohibition to outlaw alcohol. And then on the last section on the Republican resurgence, which begins on page 835. And goes through 847. You don't need to know much, but you might accept for information about some of the presidents that are highlighted in that section. All right, is that clear? Now for chapters 19 and 20, and for the beginning of chapter 21, let me just remind you of what to look for, what to be familiar with for the test. And I have misplaced my card with my test information. All right, hold on a sec. Sorry about this. There it is. Chapter 19. Remember what imperialism is. You need to know that. Know about the USS Maine. Know about the different types of foreign policy. Know about the different, I'm going to stop share here and look at you face to face. Remember the three progressive presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. Know about their foreign policies. Roosevelt was big stick diplomacy, Taft was dollar diplomacy, and Wilson was interventionism. Know what the Roosevelt corollary was. And know what the four motivating ideas of American imperialism are at the top of page 701. In chapter 20, I shared with you on the slide presentation a chart about progressivism, and there was seven streams coming into progressivism. That chart will be on the test. So you'll need to go over the slides. Know what the social gospel is and who Walter Rosenbach is. Know what settlement houses are. Know what the 3 C's of the square deal are. Know what the jungle is. And know about the election of 1912. There are 5 firsts on the test. They're on page 709. There's 2 of them on page 735. There's one on page 759, and there's one on page 764. In chapter 21, the first half, which we talked about on Monday, know about the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. Know the importance of trench warfare. Understand why World War I is the first industrial war with new weapons, the bottom of page 771. Know about the importance of June 28th, 1914. What is the significance of the the British liner Lusitania? What's the significance of the Zimmerman telegram? The Bolshevik Revolution, and then what we talked about briefly today, Wilson's 14 points and the League of Nations. This video I will put up as soon as I get it downloaded today. There's going to be a new wrinkle to the test. So make sure you hear this. And for those of you at Howe who are watching this later, I'm going to require that you put the page number down for every answer where you find it in the book. That way you're not using the internet for your answers. So any questions about the test, which will be available not tonight, but I'll have it available tomorrow morning by 9.
So you want every answer with a page number?
Yes.
Okay.
Except for like the graph on progressivism, that'll come from the class slides.
Okay.
No questions? All right, so it'll be available at 9 in the morning, and you'll have until the end of the day, Sunday, March 8th. Have a great weekend, and look forward to seeing you on Monday.